I'm Jeanne Liedtka. I'm a faculty member in the strategy area at the Darden Graduate School of Business at the University of Virginia. I'm a business person. Most of my life I worked for the Boston Consulting Group before I became an academic. And my undergraduate is actually in accounting. So I like to say that I am the most narrowly, least creatively educated person in the world. And I think that's why I love design thinking so much. You know, there's this idea that all faculty members are secretly exploring their own kind of inadequacies. And I know for me, I've never felt like a creative person. When you're an accountant or when you're an engineer, you're told your whole life that other people are creative and you're not really. And so I guess I've always been fascinated about how, you know, those of us who aren't Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, who are kind of normal people doing normal things, can tap into our own ability to be creative and to create value and to make the world a better place. And that's what led me to design thinking. My interest has always been in strategy. So for the most part, I get to teach what some people think is the most boring thing in the world, strategic planning. And as part of my own journey as a teacher to think about how to bring to life this subject that everyone thinks of as just filling in the blanks on some template, I started to look towards the world of architecture. I'm lucky enough to be at the University of Virginia, where we have a beautiful campus that is, you know, the only World Heritage Site university campus in the US. It was designed by Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States and the author of the Declaration of Independence. And it was designed with this vision of what education should be. Right? And so for him, education of everyone, well, at least everyone in those days, in the definition of who got to be a citizen, that democracy required that everyone be educated and that they be educated in community rather than in a hierarchical system. And so he created this wonderful thing called the academical village, which is the core of our campus, which is still there from the 1820s when it was formed. And so as I began to get steeped in the story of the design, the physical design of our campus, I started to think of the ways in which what I was trying to teach people to do in strategy was exactly what Thomas Jefferson had done in UVA, to take a vision of a future that they have and then to construct a space that allowed people to live into that future. So I began reading pretty extensively in architecture, people like Frank Gehry, who are quite eloquent about their design process. Got very interested in this whole idea of strategy as a metaphor for design and worked on that for many years. And then when design thinking came along and the kind of IDEOs of the world and the particular toolkit, I realized that design wasn't just a metaphor for strategy. Design actually brought a toolkit that we could teach people who hadn't been trained as designers or artists or any of these things, that we could teach people that could help them in a much more systematic way be creative. And so that's been my own journey into design thinking. So as I pursued this interest in design thinking and learned more about it, I became really convinced that it was an important missing toolkit from the business school, where all of our tools are highly analytic. They're all predicated on worlds of certainty and predictability. And for me, the design thinking toolkit didn't replace our traditional analytical tools, but it supplemented them with something we didn't have, which was a toolkit optimized for uncertainty. So I became convinced that it was a really critical thing to teach the MBA students that I work with and to teach the executives that I work with. As I started around to look for material though, what I discovered was it was mostly either designers writing for designers, so it was not written in a language that was accessible to business people. In particular, most people who come up through design are very comfortable with ambiguity. And they don't like a lot of structure in the way they approach things. They don't like systems and process the way those of us in business and engineering do, right? So even though they were, as I observed them, doing a pretty systematically identifiable set of things, they had never written that down. And their models were very high level and abstract. And what we found is that business people, non-designers, got lost, right? You could teach them a tool like journey mapping, but then they didn't know what to do with the answer, right? Or you could tell them they had to design experiments, but then they didn't know what to put into the design of experiments. So we set out really just to translate what designers were already doing, but into a language that non-designers could embrace and use. And I think beyond that has been this philosophy of democratizing innovation. I think innovation is going through now as a field what quality went through post-World War II. Right? So if we go back to before World War II, people thought quality was something that a group of technical experts did. And it didn't have anything to do with the rest of the jobs of anybody in an organization, right? We just left it to them, to the quality people. You know, then we learned that quality had to be owned by everybody in order to be competitive. And what allowed us to make that a reality, not just a slogan, quality belongs to everybody, was total quality management, which brought with it a systematic set of tools that allowed us to teach and scale quality techniques for everyone. I think that's what design thinking holds the promise for in innovation. We're realizing that in today's environment, so much of the potential to really make people's lives better, it lives at the local level. We talk so much about wicked problems and disruptive change, and again, there's this model that it's all about the famous entrepreneur, the Elon Musk, the breaking barriers. That ignores the tremendous capacity of every one of us to contribute to making people's lives better. The people we interact with, the people we own. So we'll talk to school teachers and they'll say, well, I'd like to do different things in my classroom, but I'm kind of waiting for the superintendent to do something. And our response will be, look, you've got 20 kids in the room with you tomorrow. Why not just start? Find ways to make those 20 kids have a better experience. And when the school superintendent gets on board, great. But in the meantime, you don't have to wait for permission. You can just do it. And this is one of the great advantages of design thinking. The idea that we can all do it. We can all go out and have deeper conversations with the people we want to serve about their needs. We can all design small experiments. We can all prototype low fidelity prototypes. These are tools that everyone can use at every level in an organization or in our own personal lives. So I'm kind of on a mission to say, how do we get through the anxiety that many of us have of like stepping a little bit out of what we've been taught and our fear of failure, and teach us how to experiment and how to be human-centered and how to be data-driven. I think one of the misconceptions of design is that it's all fuzzy and stuff, but design is intensely data-driven. Like the whole point of design, and for me in the business sector, one of its big contributions is it holds us in the problem space and demands that we learn more about the reality of the lives of the people we're trying to change. And that we use that data to drive new ideas, not just something that comes to us in the shower, right? And so I think for all of these reasons, given the world as it is right now, given the uncertainty, given the kind of chaos and disruption at the systems level, a capacity to act locally, to make the changes that we can make, to have the impact on the lives of the people we can touch, that's a tremendous opportunity that can keep us hoping in a world where the news from the headquarters, whether that's political headquarters or business headquarters or whatever, is not very empowering. But here we can make a difference. And to me, that's why I'm so excited about the design toolkit and why we continue to refine a systematic process, right? Because design thinking can be very intimidating. It violates a lot of the basic things we believe, like efficiency, right? Like smart people don't make mistakes, right? So we have found that the most effective way to teach it to people who grow up in a more structured environment, like business people, engineers, accountants, is to give them a structured process to guide them through the first time or two they do it. And then they can improvise. They get comfortable, their anxiety comes down, they see it works, and they can use it. So it's been a wonderful journey. We've probably been on for 8 or so years, but I've been teaching a Coursera course, probably to, at this point, over 200,000 people. We teach a lot of this work exclusively online, so it's cheap, it's scalable, it's just got tremendous potential. There are many challenges trying to use design thinking both at a personal level and in organizations. At a personal level, most of us learn very early in our life. We take in this idea that smart people get the answer right. And there's wonderful work by psychologists like Carol Dweck looking at mindset and looking at the difference between someone who has a learning mindset, who accepts uncertainty and realizes they have to step outside what's familiar and risk making mistakes in order to succeed. Most of us went through school and learned if we didn't have the right answer, don't raise your hand. Don't make a fool of yourself and reveal your ignorance. I think that's the first challenge that most of us have at a deeply personal level. We're just afraid to make a mistake, right? And the iterative process of design requires your willingness to conduct experiments, and experiments means sometimes you'll get it wrong. And you'll only find the right answer in iteration if you're willing to listen to disconfirming data. That's the other thing, because we have so much anxiety about being wrong, we don't listen to the data when it comes back from the experiments, right? And we know this is just the old hypothesis confirmation bias. A lot of what design thinking helps us do in terms of improving decision making, we can trace back to work of people like Kahneman and Tversky. I mean, these are well-known cognitive biases that have existed for many years that design thinking gives us tools to mitigate. Right? So I think the first and biggest problem in many ways is just the fear most of us have of stepping outside the boundaries of what we know is safe and where we can get it right. I think as we go into organizations, there's another whole set of challenges, right? We need to be able to have face-to-face contact with the people we're trying to serve. I mean, we work in organizations where no one but the marketing people are allowed to talk to the customer. Well, if you can't talk to someone, you can't learn deeply about their needs, and you can't take second or third hand information and develop the deep, novel insights. Right? We know that in order to produce more creative answers, they need to come from somewhere. And where they come from is deeper, new insights about the people we're trying to serve, and that requires immersing ourselves in their lives. So we need access to those people, which is a problem. We need to tolerate the seeming inefficiency of design thinking. So design thinking is hard often for very action-oriented people in the beginning, because your idea of being decisive is to come up with an answer and get moving on it. Design thinking says, don't even think about coming up with an answer for a while. Think about the problem. Make sure you're asking the right questions. Make sure you've got all the data you can get on the job to be done of the people you're trying to serve. It holds you in this place that is uncomfortable for action-oriented people, right? It feels like it takes forever. I mean, if we look at a lot of the leading design consulting firms, they'll spend 50% of an engagement in the front-end research, what we call the what is stage, where we're just trying to understand current reality. So one of the challenges of design thinking is, I think, people get uncomfortable in that space. One of the advantages is it gives you a process that makes you stay there, even if you want to leave. And I think that this notion of false efficiency, where we're efficient because we run off and we get an answer right away, one answer, and then we go out and implement it. I mean, that's just a false sense of efficiency, because most of the time it's wrong. And then we're trying to fix it after implementation. Design thinking insists that we take the time up front, but in the end, if we take that time, the time to a scaled working solution, I would bet is less with design thinking in many instances, provided we're addressing the right kinds of questions with it. You know, it's an academic discussion, but there's all discussion, is design thinking really a thing? Because most elements have been around for a while, or they're evident somewhere else, like the focus on experimentation is shared with Lean, you know, it's shared with Agile. What makes design thinking unique to me is the bundle. And the bundle of tools and processes and the end-to-end process. So yes, we share with Lean and with Agile a focus on experimentation. We share with a lot of the kind of more human-centered focus, that focus on ethnography, right? Good old brainstorming's been around forever. But what design thinking does is it puts them together in an end-to-end process, and that is unique I think, the way it's bundled and the way that bundling works. For probably about 5 years, we studied design thinking in business organizations. I mean, I come from a business school. I joke that I'm one of the dinosaur people. I'm not even an entrepreneurship person. I work with the dinosaurs. So my area of interest has always been innovation in bureaucracies, big bureaucracies, in which people face a whole different set of challenges than they face in a startup environment. Right? So we were looking at the use of design thinking in big organizations like 3M and IBM and SAP and all these organizations. But in the process of that, we started to notice these organizations in the social sector, in areas like healthcare and education and government, where people were doing really interesting things with design thinking. In some ways, we were realizing that design thinking is even more powerful in the social sector because a lot of government policies, for instance, have had a very strong expert orientation. They haven't really tried to understand the lives of the people, for instance, in poverty that they're trying to serve. So we started to notice that in the social sector, these methods were especially effective. When you think of what happens in the social innovation sector, you've got a much more complex set of stakeholders who don't agree with each other necessarily. It's much harder to establish cause and effect. There's a lot of politics, there's a lot of ambiguity around what drives what. It's very hard to prototype some of these services and things, and so design thinking seemed to add even more value in some ways than the business sector. So we started to talk about, well, you know, design thinking really could not just make better products and services, it could actually make the world a better place. So we started to study organizations in healthcare and government and how they were using design thinking. And we've put that together in our new book, which is called Design Thinking for the Greater Good, which to me has the most motivating set of stories in it of any work we've ever done. So for instance, one of my favorites is a story from the US Health and Human Services Administration. So this is a giant government bureaucracy, 80,000 employees scattered around the US. And they've decided they want to invite any one of those 80,000 employees anywhere in the US who have a good idea, who'd like to improve their little part of the world, to step forward into an innovation competition, and they select a set of finalists, they put them through design training, they get mentoring, they get a little bit of funding and things like that. One of the stories we followed there was a young woman who was the head of quality at an Apache Indian reservation hospital in Arizona, where the wait times had reached as long as 6 hours. Because these are very remote hospitals, right? And there's no real ambulatory care, so everybody comes to the hospital for everything. The wait times were so long, though, that people were giving up and going back home. And then they were coming back with far more serious things that are wrong with them. So she had been reading about this kiosk that was in use at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, large urban medical center, decided that would really work. So she entered that in a competition. She was selected, she began the training, and of course the first thing we teach someone to do in design thinking is to examine your assumptions. Knowing the people that you're trying to serve, why do you think that this will fit with their needs? And of course what she immediately realized as she started to think about it was her Native American grandmother, who spoke relatively little English and who had nothing to do with electronic equipment, was never going to use that kiosk. And so she had, in a much more traditional way, come up with an idea out of her personal worldview that didn't fit with the needs of the people she was trying to serve. So she went down the path a little bit longer, and she came up with some alternatives. She then ran into trouble with US laws. You have to treat everyone who comes in, you can't triage, right? Took her 3 or 4 times till she finally found a solution that worked. It looks like that solution will save that hospital $6 million a year. Now, this is one, not to mention the value to the patients. It's halving wait times. Right? Here's one young woman with an idea in the middle of nowhere with some support. Look what she produced. Imagine if the other 79,999 employees of the Health and Human Services Division did anything even slightly like what she'd done. Right? That's the potential we're talking about. We're talking about unleashing the potential of teachers and nurses and people at the front lines all over the world, and we're seeing that in our stories. We're seeing strategic stories. There's one of my favorite stories in the hospital is a group of physicians at Monash University Medical Center in Melbourne, Australia, have gotten excited about design thinking and are actually leading the charge in their organization. Right? It's not a group of consultants, it's not a group of administrators, it's the doctors themselves who are looking at things like, you know, how to keep people out of the hospital who are elderly. They're looking at everything from big issues like acute inpatient psychiatric care to small issues like how to make sure people wash their hands so infection doesn't spread. Right? So what we're seeing as we look in the social sector and as we tell in the story of the design thinking for the greater good, people at all levels, in all kinds of organizations, can use these techniques to make a difference to the people they're trying to serve. And that really, to me, is what design thinking is all about.